So, one of the things we have to deal with, especially in this country, going forward regardless of what happens with Brexit, is we have to admit we are not governed well. And once you start that, you then start to think there are ideas how you can improve the calibre of MPs that go forward. And especially making sure that it's not the same ideas that go through. I've said this before on this channel, one thing that I push for is there need to be term limits for MPs. I think that there should be no such thing as a safe seat. And I think by putting in term limits, you will then wash out a lot of these MPs. Because I don't know if you've realised, especially in the Conservatives, there are a lot of Conservatives who've been there for decades. Not for, their good political acumen or anything like that. They've just sat in a safe seat because their constituency always votes Conservative. And because they always vote Conservative, they've pretty much got a job for life. So as a result, they just don't do anything. They're political lumps. In fact, I would argue that there's a good case to be made that Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't want to do anything. He wants to be this backbencher who occasionally has a loud voice but sits back in his safe seat, safe in the knowledge that nothing bad's ever going to happen. But anyway, to today's article. So this comes from The Conversation. So it's the Brexit turmoil. 5 ways British MPs misunderstand the European Union. And I completely agree. This is part of the problem of where we are. Because it's not just, as we discussed last video, it's not just the British public that don't seem to understand or know how the European Union works. It's our MPs as well. Some of our MPs are completely ignorant of this fact, of these basic facts of how the European Union works. So I'll just go, whoa, tilt it down a bit. There we go. So, with Theresa May on her way back to Brussels in an attempt to renegotiate a Brexit deal that has already been agreed, it's once again clear that she and the parliamentary colleagues who sent her on her journey still harbour fundamental misunderstandings about how the European Union actually operates and what its members think even 2 years into talks. Those who know how the EU works, such as former UK representative to Brussels Ivan Rogers, are tearing their hair out over the level of ignorance and wishful thinking on display. At this crucial stage in the Brexit process, it is important to explore why so many MPs, both Tories and Labour, misjudge the situation and what is realistically on offer. These are some of the problems that have ultimately caused such failings. They need to be recognised as soon as possible if the UK wants to thrive regardless of the Brexit outcome. So, number 1. Labour lost interest years ago. Knowledge of the EU and professional connections in Brussels have been eroding in the UK over the years because of declining priority given to it by leaders. Under Tony Blair, the government was keen to set the agenda for the EU. This started to change under Gordon Brown, who showed little interest in or appreciation of Brussels. Labour's loss of knowledge continued the longer it stayed out of power, and some former ministers left Parliament, but also because those MPs with experience of governing under Blair were also being sidelined under the new leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn himself, a lifelong Eurosceptic, tends to see the EU as an unreformable neoliberal project. Now, he erroneously thinks that delivering the 2017 Labour manifesto requires freedom from EU state aid rules. If EU membership is perceived as a problem, there is need for a coalition building within the socialist parties in Europe who want to stay and reform. So number 2, the Conservatives abandoned their friends. The Conservative understanding of the EU suffered from when David Cameron's early decision to withdraw his party from the Conservative grouping in the European Parliament in exchange for Brexiteer support for his leadership. This cut off the Conservatives from the European mainstream, damaged relations to sister parties such as the German CDU, and disrupted information flow and influence. And as a result, British MPs overestimated both Germany's capacity and willingness to accommodate British demands. In 2011, the watershed failure of the government to block the fiscal compact designed to save the Eurozone was the first sign of misreading EU partners, closely followed in 2015 by futile efforts to block Jean-Claude Juncker becoming the Commission President after his party grouping won the European Parliament elections. So number 3, they can't see the EU's viewpoint. British MPs and to some extent the British public suffer from mirror imaging when it comes to Brexit. This is when we deal with uncertainty about the intentions of the other side by imagining what is rational from our own point of view. From the perspective of many British MPs, the EU is insisting on the backstop, even if it risks a no deal, is an irrational strategy given the economic damage it would incur. Many also don't understand why Britain could not enjoy the same kind of access to the single market as before. Why would the EU block its access and at the same time create new barriers for European businesses trying to operate in the UK? This reflects a strong tendency in the British political discourse to evaluate policies and the EU in particular from a short-termist bottom-line perspective. And we've talked about this before. Ever since since the original coalition came to power, there has been this aim not for long-term policies, but for short-term policies and short-termism. There's this idea of, well, we can only run a project for at least 2 to 3 years. We're not going to bother thinking of like a long-term project that might run for 10 years or maybe more. That just doesn't seem to be the thinking of a lot of our politicians, which is madness. The EU sees Brexit not just on its own terms, but as a precedent-setting issue. How it deals with this matter will define its credibility in the future. Cutting a deal with Britain could come at the unacceptable price of weakening the Union at a time when populist parties in member states are rising. The integrity of the single market is at stake. If Northern Ireland leaves the customs union without border controls, or if Britain is allowed to undercut the standards to gain competitive advantage while enjoying good access to the single market. So no one seems to acknowledge that fact. And as we discussed in an article, must have been last year, the article's a really good one. If it took the idea of Brexit and flipped it on its head. What if it was another European country leaving? And as it said, if you look at Brexiteers and what they want and what they have campaigned for, they would be pushing for the hardest possible terms to be imposed on that country. Because if they're out of the club, why should we allow them access to our market? Four, they aren't used to compromise. Furthermore, many British MPs struggle to understand that EU politics is largely defined by compromise. They see Brussels through the lens of their own confrontational system, where two parties dominate in the first past the post elections, and this is partly because there is no longer a third party. The Liberal Democrats are still there, but they are no means a force of what they used to be. The first past the post-election and are heavily whipped to toe the party line. Many continental European countries are run by constitutional governments and parliaments focused on problem solving. Are run by coalition governments and parliaments focused on problem solving. They more readily understand that the give and take in Brussels. The EU is a compromise-making machine geared towards building the broadest possible support among its members. This only works because members agree on informal rules on how to act and share a certain amount of trust. Casting votes, going into battle with publicly announced red lines and reneging on agreements has lost the UK trust and goodwill. That lost trust has now become a major obstacle for negotiation success. And number 5, they're stuck in outdated assumptions. Finally, MPs have failed to update their thinking. Their perceived understanding of how Brussels works no longer applies. They are remembering a long EU summit negotiations of the past and late night compromises that typically enable a deal to be made. But Brexit negotiations are unlike EU summits where everyone needs to have prizes to sell at home. By deciding to leave, Britain has placed itself in a fundamental difficult position. It's now a prospective third country against which the remaining EU members must now defend their interests. The EU is keen to get Brexit done and will show flexibility, but it is not going to let either Ireland or its mandated negotiator, the European Commission, stand in the rain on such solidarity and credibility defining issue. The need to address these misunderstandings is pressing. Whatever the outcome of Brexit, it will be central to making a success of coming negotiations about future relations if May's deal ever passes. Remaining successfully would require a major change of attitude, and even if Britain crashes out, it will be connected to the EU by virtue of geography, economic links, law, security, and indeed people. As long as the EU exists and confounds Brexiteers' predictions of its imminent demise, Britain will have, without a seat at the table, will need to understand how it works and how else it can influence the EU from the outside. And that's the situation we're in, because, as I said there, we have Conservatives on one side who are daydreaming about past imperial glory days. You've then got another set of Conservatives who recognise the fact how valuable the EU is. You've then got, as I said, you've then got Labour, who all the people who had dealings with the EU under Blair have been sidelined by Corbyn because they're considered Blairites, and one of the worst things, I've said this before, one of the worst things Corbyn did was he did not reach out and try and offer some sort of terms to the Blairites to try and bring them into the fold. And because of this, he now has a party that when these past two elections have been, all these Blairite people and the moderate Labour people and New Labour people, when they've gone out, they've said, yes, vote Labour, but don't worry about Corbyn's plans because we don't think it's possible. How can you run a party that are against themselves? And both parties are in this state where whoever will win probably the next general election or even Brexit itself will be the party that can bring the party together. That's what will happen. And if Corbyn can't do it, Theresa May can't do it, we are going to be stuck in a endless cycle talking about Brexit for decades to come, or at least a decade to come, because that's what's going to happen. Brexit will dominate our politics. It already has dominated our politics for the past 2 years to a point where we have done nothing else in our country. We have so many problems in this country that, once again, once we leave the EU, these problems are still going to be there. None of these problems were caused by the EU, despite how many people harp on, oh, it's the EU's fault, it's the EU's fault. No, it's our government not addressing these issues, specifically. You've got the Conservatives who imposed austerity and have shown multiple times that austerity was a choice. Instead, the best decision they could have made was, okay, we're going to invest massively in this country, because you look at all the countries that managed to get out of the 2008 crisis the fastest were the ones that went and invested rather than say we're going to slash the funding completely. Remember, there was almost no funding, and as we've said before on this channel, local councils had to rely on EU funding to be able to stay afloat and offer services. Now that funding is gone. And as I have said repeatedly, the first council to go bankrupt was a Conservative one. It's very likely, and as most probably, there are, from what I remember of that article we went through, there were about 45 other councils who were teetering on the brink of disaster. And you've got Barnsley, who has had its budget cut by 40%, when the national average is around about 15%. And it's all been the North that has suffered the most. If you look at, again, when we went through that, all the North suffered, and it's not even that. The next town was like 35% and in the 30s. So be aware of which party did this. It was the Conservatives. And the Lib Dems, I will give them credit where credit is due, they did soften austerity. But when they won that election, primarily because Ed Miliband couldn't eat a bacon sandwich right, they went full speed ahead with austerity. We've known for ages, the government has known for ages, that universal credit is not working, that it's failing so many people. And yet they continue on with it regardless. But here we are. And those are just two problems. We haven't got yet to the housing crisis, which is going to be a housing disaster soon. Remember, and this is a fun statistic, there hasn't been a housing minister in place since the coalition government longer than 6 months. How can you solve a housing crisis when the person who is in charge, and you're meant to be in overall charge of dictating policy, isn't there long enough to draw up policy? Oh, dear me, we are, oh.